India's fight against climate change could lead to a significant rise in its debt, with Moody's ratings warning that the country's debt-to-GDP ratio could approach a worrying 99% by 2030. Why? If the government alone tries to bridge the annual gap of 3.4% of GDP for climate mitigation and adaptation, it will heavily burden the economy. Let's break this down. First off, debt to GDP ratio. This measures a country's debt compared to its total economic output or GDP. It's a key indicator of financial health. Right now, under the current conditions, Moody's predicts that India's debt to GDP ratio would be around 78% by 2030. But if the government fully tackles climate mitigation without the help of the private sector, this ratio could shoot up to nearly 99%, meaning India's debt would almost equal the total value of its annual economic production. Moody's highlighted that India would face more pressure than most comparable economies in this scenario, with the exception of South Africa and Brazil. These countries, like India, already have stretched fiscal buffers due to their existing high debt burdens. Globally, the report says US could see its debt to GDP ratio rise by 11 percentage points to 137%, while Brazil could jump by 21 points. Africa could see an even larger increase of 40 percentage points. But here's the big picture. Not acting on climate change would end up being far more costly. Moody stresses that while increasing climate-related spending would raise government debt, the economic and social cost of inaction could be much worse. In fact, emerging market economies like India stand to benefit the most from early and coordinated investments in clean energy, potentially seeing significant income gains in the long term. Now, there's a potential solution that could soften the blow for India's debt if the private sector steps in to share the burden. The increase in the debt to GDP ratio could be a much more manageable number. Instead of rising to 99%, the ratio could only increase by 8 percentage points, bringing it to 86%. In comparison, South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico would still face much higher jumps in their debt ratios. So how can India reduce its cost while addressing climate change? The report, which is backed by insights from the IMF and the World Bank, points to carbon pricing as one of the most efficient tools for reducing emissions. Carbon pricing encourages businesses and individuals to cut down on energy consumption and switch to a low carbon alternative. If India can successfully involve the private sector, the government spending on climate measures could be reduced to just 1.3% of GDP, and that is annually. And now for the price tag. India's climate mitigation efforts are expected to cost a whopping $186 billion per year until 2030. Adapting to the effects of climate change, like the rising sea level or extreme weather events, is expected to cost less than half of that. But in the long run, the cost of doing nothing could be far greater.